first of all, let's do some introductions. I would agree with what Bianca said. This is an amazing set of people. We were just talking in the speakers lounge, and just the breadth of experience here within stablecoins is incredible. And I think it just really speaks to how central stablecoins are to everything that we're doing, definitely within SDF, but more broadly in the ecosystem. Some may argue too central, but we can talk more about that. And so I wanted to have each of these speakers introduce themselves, obviously the company and the asset that they're involved in, their biggest challenge, and also how they got into crypto in the first place, in whatever order you'd like.
All right, I'll give it a start. Awesome. I'm Alex. Super excited to be here. I've done a few of these with Stellar now. Thanks, Mark. Thanks to the foundation for having me. Beautiful venue, beautiful location. So I'm the CEO of Stablecorp. We build a bunch of financial infrastructure out of Canada. Obviously, a very interesting and fun jurisdiction for digital assets. So we'll talk a lot about the differences between jurisdictions for particularly for stablecoins or stablecoin-like assets over the course of this panel. So we actually run two coins right now. One is a bank-issued deposit receipt, so really taking that bank-first approach, layering on the technology to a deposit receipt, turning it into something that can look, act, and feel like a stablecoin, but we'll talk about some of the challenges around that model as we go forward. That's called VCAD, and then also a more traditional private-issued fiat-backed reserve called QCAD as well. And I think that's part of one of our biggest challenges is really taking this world that we're all trying to create, where we're trying to rip and replace a bunch of legacy financial infrastructure and map it into a world that doesn't quite get it. And so figuring out how to take all of the good parts of digital assets and make it accessible, make it understandable, make it easy to access for regulators, for traditional financial institutions, for investors, without making so many sacrifices that we're just recreating the financial system, which is kind of the reducto ad absurdum bottom floor of engaging with different ecosystems. So we really try and take the approach of use plain language, really explain it as it is, identify risk as risk, crime is crime, fraud is fraud. We're not creating anything crazy and new, but really trying to find those places where there are major value gaps that can be unlocked by using this type of technology. So I got into crypto, actually. I was in the banking world, as I'm sure that will be a common theme here at Bank of Montreal, and really trying to manage a crypto investment banking group. And really taking that kind of core academic idea of finance being about the people who have capital meeting the people who need capital, and trying to sort of trim down the bank to be as little as possible in the middle of that. And obviously that's super challenging to do from within a gigantic financial institution. So I left there in 2017 to start a venture fund, turn it into a yield fund, and then started this journey from here. But excited to go through this.
Awesome, thank you. Tiana?
I'm Tina Baker-Taylor. I think it says that I work at Stellar, which is cool, but I don't.
Welcome on board.
Maybe.
This is how jobs happen.
Yeah. I lead policy in Europe for Circle. Circle is the sole issuer of USDC, which I'm sure most of you know what that is. In June, we also launched a euro-based stablecoin, so Eurocoin. Is steadily growing, and I think the primary challenge for Circle at the moment, we're probably the most traditional and conservative of stablecoin business models. Essentially, all of the tokens we issue are backed one for one in the currency that they're denominated in. Those reserves are held in financial institutions, and are always redeemable for the currency that the token is issued in. And so when you're at that intersection of basically taking in kind of deposits in dollars or euros, you do sit very closely aligned and within the existing banking system. And so I think ultimately the mission of Circle today is to really kind of super speed or create a digital representation of currency that allows them to become internet deployable, internet ready, internet usable. I got into crypto very similar. I was in a financial institution, a series of them, and my last role was overseeing innovation labs for a large bank. And you're a little bit of a kind of hamster in a wheel going round and round, round and round, with one proof of concept after another, kind of knowing that none of them were ever going to come to fruition, and that became a bit soul-destroying. And so for me, the best part of learning about digital, ledger technology was the tokenization element. And so I left specifically to work in actual native crypto because that was the use case that I think had the most value when you look at blockchain technology.
And I think we were talking about how there are likely a lot of people still in those roles at banks now thinking about digital currencies, maybe not even decentralized currencies.
Yeah, I mean, banks are definitely, they haven't, given up on this. If anything, they've kind of woken up. And I think that they see that there is certainly, money being left on the table by either being constrained by regulators or standard bodies like BAS, or internally by their compliance and risk departments. But equally, I think we've gone through a few periods around kind of enterprise blockchain, where we've now this is probably the third go around where we identify that actually open source technology is the game changer, not closed walled gardens. And so certainly from a Circle perspective, we think that that's the true innovation. Will banks get there and develop some kind of, interoperable stablecoin-like, tokenized deposit that they can, trade amongst themselves and compete with CBDCs? Maybe. But my experience in a bank is that those things don't happen very fast. And so hopefully if we can all get our shit together, then maybe we can kind of displace that from happening and bring those financial institutions into the ecosystem that we create that has safety, transparency, and trust built in.
So 2 clarifications from Tiana. She works for Circle, not SDF, and we all got to get our shit together. MJ?
Yeah, so my name's MJ, or Michaela Jurek. That's if you're wondering what it stands for. I'm from a company called Novati, which is an Australian-based fintech. So we just recently announced, probably about 2 hours ago, that we are going live with our Australian dollar-backed stablecoin, AUDD, on the Stellar network.
Awesome.
In terms of hurdles, or our biggest hurdle, is definitely our regulatory climate within Australia. We are operating in a bit of a grey area at the moment, where it's just stable coins, digital assets, any services that sort of utilise any of those crypto assets. There's just nothing there to support them in terms of what they should be doing, how they should be protecting consumers, and how they should be treated. And so that's one of our major hurdles. In saying that, though, what we have done to try and mitigate some of that is we've partnered with a local university, Victoria University, to help establish our ethical framework, as we call it, which is essentially the framework that we're building out that tells us how we should regulate a stablecoin without actually having a regulator. And so obviously the reason for bringing on a university is to ensure that there's some academic approach to it, and also just to keep the bias, I guess you would say, in check. So in terms of how I got into cryptocurrency, which is, I guess, the answer that everyone's interested to hear. So not a bank. So I got into cryptocurrency, or Bitcoin rather, in 2013. And the way I got into it was because I had purchased Bitcoin to buy drugs on the darknet to kill myself because I was manically depressed. Obviously that didn't happen. I'm still here because it turns out I actually got scammed and the drugs were fake. And that's essentially like why I survived. So following on from that, a few months later, I had some extra Bitcoin that was in my account that I purchased from trying to buy the drugs. logged into my Bitcoin wallet wanting to buy more Bitcoin because I was going to try again, realized that the Bitcoin that I'd purchased for $50, and there was 4 there, was now worth $1,200 each. So my holding had moved from 200 to 4,800, which at the time I was like 19, 20. It was, that's a lot of money for a 20-year-old. And so from there I ended up diving down this massive rabbit hole of, what is Bitcoin? What are economic fundamentals? And yeah, that's how I got into crypto.
It's amazing.
Saved your life.
Yeah.
Crypto saved my life. And then a few years later, I ended up buying my house with that Bitcoin. So
It's an inspirational story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that. So I think thinking about stablecoins going forwards, I was wondering if we could reflect on what the biggest use cases are within DeFi, but also outside of DeFi. What are you seeing?
Yeah, and I think it's if you'd asked us that question 9 months or 12 months ago, it'd probably be a very different answer than what it is today. And that's kind of a hallmark of market cycles. In the the hypey, toppy, everything is happening now type era, the use cases for stablecoins are those types of things: NFT trading, stacked DeFi, all of those really kind of innovative but very future-facing type of applications. And I think what we're seeing in kind of as the market pendulum swings back to a little bit more, okay, where's the fundamental value from today and how do we innovate from today forward, is a lot more things around cross-border payments. I mean, FX is something that I think we want to talk about a bunch on this. 99% of all digital assets used today is kind of US dollar denominated. And in a global, we're in Rome, in a global economy, that doesn't work. It can work in those more crypto native use cases where maybe there is sort of a single currency. But as we start to displace real businesses with real margins and real kind of profit lines where you're looking at more of a cost savings basis, one currency doesn't work. So how do we create those types of exchanges where we're going natively stablecoin to stablecoin at the same exchange rates and the same spreads and at those kind of institutional grade types of liquidity, both centrally and decentrally? And how do we kind of automate that into an actual transaction flow? So I think that's where we're spending a lot of our time right now, is where are there existing flows of commerce that can be replicated using digital assets in a really true public blockchain facing way, where we're not just kind of faking it and hacking it on the back end, and you can get those step function improvements where you're not saving 5%, but you're saving 95% of costs. So that's really what's going to be kind of the driver of a new wave of growth, in addition to all of the digital assets and trading use cases that we're kind of used to as well.
Yeah, and I mean, on top of that as well, I mean, the use cases will also depend on the blockchains that you're delivering it on. So with Stellar specifically, for example, you're focusing on use cases that are more payments driven. So whether that be cross-border, remittance, settlements, payments, you'll find that something like Stellar, for example, is more suited for that because of the cost, or lack thereof cost, to actually process that transaction, in comparison to something like Ethereum. While immensely popular for certain aspects or certain use cases, could you imagine processing a microtransaction on Ethereum? It probably wouldn't let you, because to send $2 it probably costs you 13. So.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the FX use case is one that we're leaning into with the issuance of additional stablecoins and having no slippage within those, by ensuring that each of those assets is reserved by the asset that is denominated in the token. I think there are some euro stablecoins that are backed by dollars, for example, and so you're going to have some inherent slippage within that, and we don't. But when I think about DeFi or decentralized finance, I think a lot of us think about yield products and farming and some of the cooler products and services that have come out of the last crypto winter. But for me, I think a little bit more around inclusion and some of the opportunities to bring services to underserved or unserved members of the world. A classic use case, I think, leaning into the cross-border payments. Maybe it's not so much of payments, but remittances, peer-to-peer payments is the MoneyGram Stellar partnership, which does use USDC to settle transactions. But so if you have a Stellar wallet, you can receive money from anyone, anywhere in the world, walk into a traditional financial type of institution and receive either cash or the top up in your wallet of whatever that transaction was. And so that's a use case that's helping real people move money around that have had less options previously. And I think that's really incredible. I think one of the other use cases that's really cool, especially in emerging markets, is payroll. And we don't really think about that, but in some countries, literally helicopter cash is flown in and handed to people, and people have to walk home with all this cash in their wallet, and it's unsafe. So there's been lots of technology that has tried to solve this problem with mobile money, services, etc. But if you can pay people in the currency that they have to pay their bills in, and not just dollars, for example, then that creates a whole new opportunity. And being able to lower those costs, I think, is incredible. There's a lot of tax potentials when it comes to payroll. So these are things that maybe seem a little bit boring, but for real people, these are challenges that they face, and these things matter.
I think we already skipped over the boring use cases back in like 14, 15 when we were starting to build this and went right to the cool ones. And I think it's a really good time to go back to the boring ones and get the blocking and tackling right.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, it's payments is great, but you can't make the payment without having a store of value there. So being able to actually physically hold that in a safe and secure manner that isn't a duffel bag full of cash on your way home from work. I think that's an important component in being able to facilitate any use case, is the ability to actually hold the value itself.
Well, and stable value too. So again, going back to some of those more emerging economies, you could get paid in the morning, and by the afternoon, what you had is now worth a fraction of what it was. And so if you have, potentially the ability to move into a more stable currency in its internet device ready, digital form, then it allows you to actually be able to do some financial planning that you weren't able to do in your native currency.
But then thinking of stablecoins as being that stable source of currency, what's the path for the regulators or institutions or even regular people having trust in stablecoins after Terra Luna, after some of the stuff that's happening? I think people who are close to it might understand the differences between different types of stablecoins, but regulators or people who are a little further away might think that it's all the same. How do you overcome that?
Yeah, well, that's a great point, and some of it comes down to nomenclature as well. I mean, I always use the analogy of a bunch of complex math that happens to equal $1 is very different than $1 that has a little bit of technology on top of it. And the fact that both of those equal $1, it doesn't. They're very, very dissimilar from each other. And so there's some types of stable coins, whether it's fully fiat reserved or bank issued, that are kind of ready for prime time, ready for the use cases of today. And I think that's generally what the people on this stage are building. But then there's a big part of Web3 is experimentation and building new types of models and building new types of financial efficiency. I mean, because there has been historically algorithmic stablecoins that have had terrible outcomes, that doesn't mean that the idea of creating stability via algorithms and via other types of mechanisms is necessarily inherently a bad idea. So I think it's really about sort of bucketing out what's ready for production today, what's still in experimental phase and needs to be sandboxed and needs to be maintained on sizing and needs to be monitored quite a bit closer. And then I think also nomenclature of a stable coin is not a stable coin is not a stable coin. Now that's hard because there's a lot of capital that's been bound up in the term stable coin. But it's used to describe things that are very, very, very different. So I think it's kind of up to us as an industry to use the right language when we're talking with regulators, when we're describing outputs, when we're when we're kind of positioning how these assets are backed. And some of that is the right financial language as well, whether it's the credit rating that underpins these things, whether it is the technology risk that underpins these things, rather than kind of creating a new bucket and saying, hey, it's nothing like what we did before, don't worry, trust us. Create those right models, find those right models that explain it better, and position just what's novel about that type of asset rather than this is an entirely new thing. So I think those have all had some level of success anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have had this happen throughout this movement over time. One of the very first projects that I worked on was a taxonomy for digital assets for regulators, and I think there's probably been 500 since. And getting the vernacular right has always been difficult. So a stablecoin could be a myriad of things. We tend to use the term either payment stablecoin or digital currency now. But again, it is trying to break down what the difference in models are. And without saying one is better than another, because, I agree with you. I think there probably is an algorithmic stablecoin that will be able to maintain a stable value and be indeed trustworthy. I don't know what that looks like, and I'm not a quant, so somebody smarter than me will figure that out.
It's interesting. The question is, can people hold in their head the idea that there's a stablecoin that may have like a 95% or 90% chance of holding its value? That's something SPF recently said on a program. It's like there's probably room for that in the market somewhere, but I don't know if that's something people can actually understand.
Well, and I think that's it. So marrying that to those use cases, I think is kind of where the rubber meets the road, and being able to articulate the differences for policymakers, I think specifically around what you're doing and what the art of the possible it is and where the gap is. And I also think we've seen this happening. I am 100% certain that stablecoins will be the asset type that is regulated in more jurisdictions first, right? So we're seeing bills being proposed in the US. We were hopeful that something might get passed by the end of this year. It's probably going to get hit to the next Congress. Stablecoins will be regulated within MiCA in the EU. There is a bill in Parliament right now in the UK that is bringing stablecoins in. So you've got like 3 major markets here that within the next 12 to 18 months, we're probably going to have live legislation that translates into regulatory regimes for stablecoins. And so within that, then it does give the industry somewhere to start and maybe start to build some trust and credibility, which then I think gives more permission to the weird and wonderful.
But I still think that it needs to be addressed, though, in terms of the backing. So, I mean, it's all fine and good to say, okay, we're backed by cash and cash equivalents. We would think that's the safest, option. But a key part of that conversation is centralization risk. It's all fine and good to put the money in a bank account, but what happens when that bank goes under, if it does? It's all fine and good to, back it with other cryptocurrencies, but what happens when those cryptocurrencies drop in value? And what happens when we do go down that road of algorithmic stablecoins? Where we're essentially relying on algorithms and computers to determine the value. We've already seen how that can, deteriorate very quickly. It's almost like we need to consider a hybrid of, and having a selection in order to diversify how we actually back a stablecoin, even if it's, using other stablecoins to back the stablecoin. I mean, it sounds like a terrible idea, but at the same time, it's, what other options do you have to diversify?
Well, DAI is pretty much backed by USDC now, so.
And that we'll talk about interoperability with CBDCs or hybrid models like what we're doing as well. And I think there's actually a really cool model where you can back stablecoins with other less lower velocity, more kind of sticky stablecoins, and then you can build algorithmic issuance models on top of that, but with a very, very stable kind of core asset underneath it. And those are, even when you said, hey, there's cash in a bank. The bank goes down, one thing, but if the issuer goes down as well, that's probably even a bigger risk. So how do you build the technology layers that make those assets behind it as bankruptcy remote as possible? And that's kind of there's a ton of room between the I've got a bunch of cash in a bank, trust me model, and the bank is issuing the asset, trust them model, and the government is issuing the asset, trust them model. There's a ton of room for innovation in between each of those leaps, and some of it is going to be those hybrid styles, and that's sort of the joy of blockchain. We can create a bunch of different things and automate and programmatically make them interoperable with each other. It's just about building the tech and ultimately building the front end so that the grandmas and grandpas of the world just use it and it's better, and they don't need to know about all of this crazy complexity underneath.
Well, have we achieved that bankruptcy remote state? Like if the issuer goes down, the people who own the stablecoin, are they protected?
Well, in our model, our reserves again are we try to limit concentration risk as much as possible by holding reserves in a multitude of different banks. We very transparent. You can go on our website every single month and see what assets we hold and where. 80% of them are in U.S. Treasuries now, which are redeemable 30 day, I think. Might be a few still in 90 day, but highly liquid assets. And so if we were to go bankrupt, God forbid, it kind of doesn't matter because those funds aren't ours. They're in reserve accounts. We can't lend them, we can't hypothecate them, we can't use them to pay our bills. They're not operational to our business in any way. So yes, in that scenario, USDC and Eurocoin are immediately redeemable.
Yeah, and I think there's a few models that we can play with as well around account control agreements, in trust for accounts, of like really kind of taking that and codifying it as much as possible to sort of take the commercial paper risk out of the actual front end issuer. But it's an evolution as much as the technology on the model side as well, and we're seeing evolutions in the experimental of the very kind of very experimental types of algorithmic stablecoins, but we're constantly evolving those kind of production ready models of stablecoins as well. And I think you're seeing some of the the leading edge of the stablecoin industry right now. But this technology moves incredibly fast, and so we will continue to innovate and evolve those models on the back end as well.
And in terms of like dispersion of funds, for example, one thing that we've been looking into as well is so blockchain-based oracles. So being able to essentially decentralize how we validate the funds coming in, so that way they can be adequately dispersed back out as well.
That makes sense. All right, so I've got one more question, then I'm going to throw it to audience questions. So please think about anything you'd want to ask. So let's talk about regulators. I would love your thoughts about regulatory outlook and whether CBDCs are just an excuse for central bankers to spice up their LinkedIn profiles.
So in Australia, we had just had the release of the CBDC white paper by the RBA, Reserve Bank of Australia. So they've come out and said that they've essentially done a pilot program with a Australian dollar, the EAUD, which is on a closed, private permissioned Ethereum chain, which nobody can see, no one can validate, and no one can really interact with. So it kind of begs the question, what's the point of the blockchain there? In terms of our regulatory climate, like I said, we don't really have a lot of answers at this stage. Of course, we've had a lot of speaking about it. We had a Senate inquiry, which was Australia's Financial Technology Centre, which took place about this time last year. From that, we were able to get a consultation paper out of it. But then a week after the consultation was, all the papers were due, we had a change in government. So that whole process has essentially been wound back and we have to start again. But we're hoping that with this new intake of government, they look to be sort of pivoting in their approach. So originally it was how do we regulate the exchanges or the service providers, which was affectionately known as CASPers, which was quite ironic because they're usually exchanges that disappear with your money like a ghost, ha ha ha. Whereas now they seem to be having that pivot of looking at how do we actually identify what each crypto asset does? What is it? What does it do? And from that we've sort of garnered, okay, it looks like the government are now trying to get an understanding of what they're actually working with, so that way they can go forward and regulate accordingly, as opposed to just slapping regulation on the providers themselves without actually understanding what it is they're trying to regulate.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and I was just going to maybe add a little twist. It'd be great to get a read of if you think that the regulators are understanding what you guys are doing.
Yes, with a big asterisk and a caveat. I think we've done an okay job as an industry of feeding certain things in there, especially over the last couple of years. And we're very kind of involved in regulatory conversations, and the general level of discourse and understanding has increased exponentially, and that includes banks as well. Like whether they're doing anything with it is very different, but the general understanding, particularly around stuff that they can really get their heads around, like stablecoins, is quite a bit higher than it used to be. So in Canada, OSFI, our banking regulator, just came out with some more guidelines about how banks should be interacting with stablecoins and digital assets. which was a lot in consultation with our bank partner VersaBank around where and how that those could be looked at going forward. And there isn't clarity, and there isn't really clarity in much of the markets, and that's still going to be a huge problem. So we were talking backstage, and I know you'll talk a bunch more about Micah. Even if the model isn't great from a regulatory perspective, like, give it to us. We'll put it into our own models, and we can create business models around it. Like, clarity is so much more important than kind of this making your best interpretation. But you can build really cool and interesting moats out of driving business models through gray areas as well. So it's really this risk tolerance approach for you as an asset issuer or a technology provider. And I think in general, Canada's done pretty well in the digital asset space. We're ahead in Bitcoin ETFs and a few of those pieces, but we're really still craving that clarity, as I think we all are.
Yeah, so I think if we look at kind of the three markets that I focus on, do regulators understand the industry? I would say yes. Instead of the caveat, I think what I would offer, especially when you're talking about, well, actually, Europe, the UK, and the US, I think all kind of share this kind of willful ignorance. Right, it's like they intentionally don't want to fully understand what you're trying to tell them, because then that gives them the permission to not act, right? So inaction. So Europe, obviously, most people in here will know that the markets and crypto assets regulation has passed. A bunch of hurdles from being voted on until actual legislation just came out last week. But the language is final now, and this goes from the legislative process into the rulemaking process. And so for anyone that doesn't understand that, like, the law kind of tells you what's supposed to happen, but it's actually the regulator level that determines how that's going to happen. And so I think the one thing that Micah gives 27 member states and anybody willing to build a business in one of them the ability to passport to all 27. And that provides Europe with a pretty incredible competitive advantage. Because it provides clarity. So it might not be easy, and I'm kind of the belief that it probably shouldn't be if you're dealing with financial services, it's people's money, and things like AML risk, etc. But now at least you know what the rules are, and if you're going to make an investment in those jurisdictions, you have a pretty good understanding of what your market potential might be across Europe. The UK, again, has been kind of wait and see and slow. There's a lot of conversations between the UK and the US, and I don't think that it is an accident that both are looking to push stablecoin regulation forward first. I think it is probably the most easiest to get your arms around. Globally, we're seeing regulators from, or standard bodies like the FSB and FATF, BIS, as well as national regulators really take a step back on DeFi and NFTs and kind of the more unknown, newer areas of the industry, and not look to regulate them immediately because they realize that they don't know enough. And I think that's actually quite encouraging. So, I have been at this for a long time, and I spend most of my time talking to the regulatory and legislative community. And yes, they do get it. Whether or not they're in a position to want to act is different. Your question about central banks, I think if you look at, Europe is very committed to issuing a CBDC. That is absolutely going to happen. Whether they're going to essentially make sure that they have the infrastructure in place, the connectivity, the broadband access, be able to kind of upskill a number of, financial literacy issues that they have for people to actually use the CBDC is still, I think, being discussed. And then in the UK and the US, you have kind of the legislative bodies saying, what do we need this for? Specifically to retail CBDCs. And then you do have central bankers saying, well, but this could be quite cool, and maybe it's a little bit of FOMO, I don't know. But what I can say is both of those jurisdictions have a payment system that isn't great. The UK is better than the US, but it kind of works. So reinventing something that is kind of working usually takes longer than fixing something that is inherently broken.
The story of crypto.
We'll get there. Yes, any questions from the audience?
Yeah, no worries. Okay, great panel, guys. I guess this is to the panel, but specifically to Hannah, I'm really curious to your opinion on this one. So in a world where we finally will have CBDCs, could you speak, maybe from a regulatory perspective even, what are the set of problems CBDCs are there to solve? What are stablecoin problems there to solve, right? From a user perspective, I don't really care about the banks. And the second part, what are the opportunities to interoperate? And again, not from a tech perspective, use cases. What can we do with our stablecoins when we have CBDCs? What do they enable for us?
Well, I'll try and keep this short so you guys can opine, but we have public and private money today, and they interoperate, and we use them both. But for retail usage, we don't go to the central bank for them to distribute money directly to us, and there's a very good reason for that. If you look at the ways in which commercial banks serve communities, creating credit, people buying homes, loans, etc. There's a whole reason for having this kind of privately issued money that is backed by a central bank reserve or a central bank reserve account. I think the different use cases are going to be really dependent upon how those CBDCs are actually developed. So a number of the CBDCs that are in pilot today, and there's a lot of them, it's like 155 or something, aren't using blockchain technology. And so what you have is a souped up version of what you already have, which cash is already digitalized, right? And then not being able to kind of plug into what I think is going to be, just Web3, the next iteration of the internet. And so if those two things don't interoperate, I think you're still going to have friction from, the public money side that the private money innovations will continue to solve.
Yeah, and it's really interesting you brought up kind of existing public and private money, and I think that's exactly where this goes in kind of a perfect world. Well, not a perfect world, but we have the banks right now almost as the intermediary between that private and public money. They're the money multipliers, they're the credit grantors, and in a fully on-chain world that sort of replicates our current system but better. Theoretically, we could algorithmize those banking institutions. So if we have actual on-chain CBDCs and then a layer of whatever we want to call it, DAO-based banks that do the credit process and have the private issued stablecoins on top of it, that's a cool evolution that doesn't, that sort of takes a model that's today has all sorts of weird frictions and politics around it and makes it, programmable and transparent. It's, it's still an evolution of today's model instead of something more radical that maybe some of us in this room are hoping for. But that's an interesting use case of interoperability. And I think even a simpler version of that, of backing a privately issued stablecoin with a CBDC on the back end, and then building out the equivalency tech between the two is sort of an even shorter use case potentially.
Yeah, that gives you the platform to build other products and services on top of, right? I mean, today we don't necessarily want to build a DeFi platform on top of a CBDC because it doesn't necessarily create the other, ability to plug in lots of other things within that. I think the other thing is it's going to be a real challenge around kind of closed loop systems, and if governments are actually going to decide to use open source technology. I'm not convinced that they will.
You think they'll stick with a closed loop system and closed source technology?
I think initially probably, and maybe figure out that was silly.
Yeah, and the other part of that as well is, do we really want to rely on a CBDC to to innovate and provide change to essentially real-world issues. And I don't think we should be relying on a government for that. I think that should probably be relied upon by the private sector, therefore privately issued stablecoins, because they will have that ability to make it more efficient. A prime example of that is that we had we had a talk recently where one of RBA, who was, they had a head there that was dealing with the CBDC development. Now, his idea was, oh, well, domestically, our system is fine. We don't actually need to do anything about it. And I think that's such a closed-minded opinion or stance to take, particularly around something that is blockchain based, and it just goes to show how uninnovative they are in terms of approaching use cases that actually provide real world utility and real world solutions.
Yeah. So I think we maybe have time for one more, and then we'll call it. Thank you.
We can.
Ken?
Now we
Hey, there we go. Let me frame it well. So I guess we're thinking about building the best version of money. You're thinking about stability, about it being backed by the best assets and all the benefits blockchain has to offer, like being able to keep your money. But then if you're really trying to build the best version of money, do you ever think of the underlying asset that's backing the stablecoins, CBDCs, and how good a money that is? And are you thinking about solving that problem?
So I'll take a first stab at this. So it's an interesting question, and I think it all comes down to what version of crypto do we see in the future? Because there's a version that is, hey, we've got a weird financial system today that fundamentally sort of does what we want it to, but with these massive friction moats and exclusion and all sorts of terrible stuff. Do we want to create a better version of that using blockchain? That's an okay outcome. That's kind of the stablecoin outcome that we're sort of going towards today in the basest of base cases, where we're taking existing fiat that's kind of annoying to move around. We're saying, okay, let's lock it up in the safest way possible. Let's create these cool digital representations of it on top, and let's go out and and solve the world's problems. To me, that's a little bit of a hack to adoption. So it's a very vanilla way to get people comfortable with the infrastructure of digital assets. The idea of being your own custodian, the idea of having more control, having more responsibility of your own assets, all of those things are great outcomes of crypto. But ultimately, I mean, back to the Satoshi white paper of Bitcoin, it's not about tokenizing or taking existing fiat and replicating it. It was about creating this entirely new form of asset that does have different fundamentals, different free-floating value, different core pieces to it. And right now we can't use Bitcoin to run a margin business or to take payments as a small business. But eventually, as you can use Bitcoin to receive and also pay your suppliers and whether it's Bitcoin or whether it's some other form of optimal money that underpins it, that's really kind of the V2, V3, V4, whatever we want to think about it of digital assets. So stablecoins I always look at as a bridge from kind of bootstrapping the digital asset world with today's financial system stability. But it might be the ultimate end goal, but it may well not be, and it may be some optimal form of money that isn't tethered to our existing form of fiat, that is that bridge to kind of the really crazy and interesting versions of commerce that, again, I think we're all kind of potentially building towards.
Yeah, definitely, perfect explanation there, and stablecoins are providing that bridge to moving into a completely decentralized system. If you look at, how much of a disruptor Bitcoin initially was, right, and that concept of self-sovereignty, we've been in a financial ecosystem where we've been heavily reliant on traditional finance and central banks for hundreds of years. Trying to quit that cold turkey, it's a bit like saying, I'm going to quit smoking tomorrow. No patches, no gum. You might get through it in a couple of get through the first few weeks, but then you might end up
Then
finding
terror
yourself back.
happens.
Yeah. Exactly. Something stressful happens, and you've got to go back. And so yeah, it is almost like a gateway into weaning yourself off the traditional finance system. I know I've been like debanked 98 times, so having to wean myself off the traditional finance system, not by choice, but because I have to. I can tell you how difficult that process is, because that's a process that's taken, in terms of reaching that number, and I'm hoping I get a trophy, by the way. It's taken
It's out there somewhere.
somewhere, lost in the mail.
NFT.
It's taken 6 years to get to that point. And so if you could imagine any other person that's trying to do that, and you think about how you pay your bills currently, obviously it's depending on jurisdiction, of course. But in Australia, for example, where we're heavily reliant on tap and pay and pay ID, which is that instant settlement of domestic transfers, trying to completely disconnect yourself from that is very difficult. And so we do need this, transition period with the form of stablecoins to get us to that next step.
That's great. I think we have to wrap it there. So thank you to our panelists, and they'll be around at the rest of the conference if you want to ask them anything else.
Thanks, guys.